What's up guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're looking at another driller build in DeepRockGalactic that turns you into a walking biohazard capable of debilitating and irradiating every enemy that you come across. From small to large, this build can handle pretty much anything thrown at you. So if you guys are ready, let's go through the Atomic Atomizer build for the driller class in DeepRockGalactic. By the way, if you want to see more build videos or just more videos in general, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so that way you never miss another upload. This build is one that I put together that again makes you feel like you are a walking biohazard container and essentially turns you into this atomic devastating machine whose main goal is basically to spread as many debilitating effects as humanly possible to as many bugs as you can. The main idea with this build is to coat as many bugs with sludge as humanly possible using our primary weapon, of course the corrosive sludge pump, and in combination with our secondary, which is the Colette wave cooker, to in essence make it so that way the enemies are suffered from just about as many different debilitating effects as humanly possible that the driller is capable of putting out. The enemies are going to be slowed, corroded, and even irradiated to the point where they will be taking insane damage over time, and in some cases they might not even be able to get to you with how slow they are moving. The build is very flexible and allows you to use your weapons in a wide variety and allows you to approach different encounters with enemies in different ways depending on what it is that you are going up against. And in essence, you are a walking radioactive canister that is oozing and emitting toxic waste, and even the biggest things that you will come across are going to suffer to your debilitating effects. So now getting into the actual gameplay of the build, as I said, this is a very flexible build that has the ability to approach different encounters to a good degree as well as give you a ton of different options depending on what you're going up against. Primary objective for this build is to, as I said, spread as many different negative effects to the enemies as you possibly can using the tools at our disposal. To bring the build together, our primary weapon is the corrosive sludge pump with the Sludge Blast Overclock. Sludge Blast basically allows us to use our corrosive sludge pump like shotgun, and instead of firing a grenade launcher type projectile, instead you fire this sort of spread of sludge projectiles that are able to coat either one enemy incredibly well or a group of enemies to a good degree. The enemies covered in the sludge are of course going to take damage over time and slow down, which really help lean into the strategy that we are trying to pull off here. Now the good thing about the Sludge Blast Overclock is that it doesn't necessarily take away your ability to use the sludge pump normally. In fact, when you're fighting smaller singular threats, using the normal single shots are the better option for you, as you don't want to waste all of your ammo with the sludge blasts on just one small enemy, which then allows you to save those big blasts for the groups of enemies or the larger threats that you're going to be going up against. And also, this overclock absolutely devastates armored enemies. It will melt them off incredibly quickly, so things like Praetorians, Stingtails, and anything else that has heavy type armor is going to be absolutely devastated by this overclock if you're able to get all the projectiles to hit. And for our secondary weapon, we have the Colette wave cooker with the Gamma Contamination Overclock. This overclock makes the beam a little bit less effective and also takes away a bit of your magazine capacity, but also makes it so that way the beam is capable of irradiating enemies, which again further stacks on damage over time effects, which is what we really want to lean into with this particular build. This is a very effective tool for crowd controls as you're able to quickly swipe the beam through the entire field and coat many enemies in radiation damage as well as slowing them down thanks to the specific loadouts that we're using. It is fantastic for mass slowdown and bringing huge swarms to a complete halt, as well as again stacking large damage over time abilities. Between both of these tools, we have a very heavy slowdown focus with our equipment. You're not going to be dealing a very heavy amount of burst damage, at least in most circumstances, and instead what you're trying to go for is the long game with very smooth and steady damage over time effects to whittle down basically anything that you're coming across. I will say the only real thing that this build kind of does struggle a little bit with is bots. The bots are a little bit more difficult to take out with these particular effects, so you might struggle a little bit on sabotage or even just rival presence missions, but other than that, there really isn't that many things that you're going to come across that are going to be difficult for you to handle. Even things like oppressors are going to fall very quickly because you have such a heavy amount of damage over time abilities that even their unbreakable armor won't really stop them. Even against massive groups of Praetorians and heavily armored enemies, the sheer amount of corrosion and damage over time slowdown that we have is going to make them an absolute joke to go through. Next, going into the actual loadout of the build, first we have our perks as usual, and for this I'm running a slight deviation of what I normally run. I have Resupplier, Born Ready, and Sweet Tooth. Resupplier is again fantastic, and I always say it's one of the best passive perks in the game. Born Ready, again in the same way. On this build specifically, it is very nice because the Sludge Blast makes our reload a lot longer, so we want to try to shorten that as much as we can, and we do switch weapons very often with this build, so it just makes the most sense. And Sweet Tooth is just good to give us a little bit more survivability and allow us to stay healthy and topped off as much as we can. For active perks, I'm going with, again, a slight deviation. I have Iron Will and Berserker just to mix things up a little bit. For some reason, Berserker has always seemed to me as a perk that was made for Driller. He just seems to be the one who I feel would benefit the most from Berserker. But again, you could go with a simple Dash and Iron Will combo, or even throw something like Beastmaster in if you wanted to. But this just gives us the ability to burn through enemies a little bit quicker with our melee if we need to, if we do come across those problematic oppressors that we just maybe don't have the ammo to deal with. Next, getting into the rest of the gear, first we have our throwable grenade. And for this build, it really doesn't matter which one you use. I'm just choosing the throwing axes because I think they're the most fun and the most satisfying, but you could really use whatever you want. If you want to really lean into the chemical idea of this build, you could use the neurotoxin grenades that would stack even more damage over time on top of it, or even the HE grenades just for some strong burst damage wouldn't be a bad idea either. Moving over to the actual weapons themselves, first we have the corrosive sludge pump with the aforementioned sludge blast overclock. The corrosive sludge pump is already a very strong weapon as it has the ability to handle even the biggest enemies incredibly easily thanks to its innate corrosive capabilities, and the sludge blast just gives us a new way to use it that could help us in various situations. Basically what the sludge blast does is it makes it so that way instead of the normal way that the weapon functions, where the charged shots fire out these massive balls of sludge that then fragment into smaller balls of sludge, instead it functions sort of like a shotgun blast where you instead will fire out these group of fragmented sludge blasts that can hit individual enemies or even the same enemy if you hit all of them. Now this does also come with the drawback of the less charge shot area damage, less ammo, and a longer reload time, so it can be a little bit difficult to use this overclock at first, but it is incredibly powerful if you're able to use it properly. Essentially what this allows you to do is be in a lot more control over the area itself that you are trying to code with the charged shots. It also allows you to code the entirety of larger enemies if you're able to get close enough. This makes taking out things like Praetorians and oppressors and any other sort of large threat very easily. It also gives you a lot of control over the weapon because you can still use the normal uncharged shots normally and they function the exact same way. Essentially, you want to use the weapon normally with its normal shots when you're trying to take out these smaller threats or the individual targets that you don't really want to waste a whole lot of ammo on, and then save the actual blast attack for either coating a large area, coating a large swarm, or coating one big enemy so that way it just takes a bunch of damage. To make the weapon even better, in Tier 1 I chose the high capacity tanks just to give us a little bit more magazine capacity since we are going to be burning through it relatively quickly. In Tier 2 I went with the extra splash damage to sort of help offset the overclock as well as just make it hit even harder. In Tier 3 I went with more ammo just to give us more reserves because again, since we are going to be charging more often than not, we're going to be burning through our ammo a little bit faster. Now Tier 4 is kind of up to you, but in testing I decided to go with the reduced charge shot cost, and let me explain why. Yes, the much faster charge speed is very nice, but it does, however, make it so that you are a little bit less ammo efficient with your shots overall. Basically, if you take the improved cooling mechanism, which reduces the charge up time, yes, you will be able to charge up a lot quicker, but you'll only be able to get 8 charged blasts per full magazine. With the spillback extension, which reduces the charge shot count, you'll be able to get 10 shots, which means that each magazine will in turn be able to fire off more blasts, which in turn is what we really want to do. Yes, the slower charge speed can be a little bit annoying sometimes, but once you get used to it, it's really not that big of a deal. But if you really wanted to, you could go with the reduced charge time and still be able to function very well. Then finally, in the 5th tier, again, this choice kind of comes down to you, but I wanted to take the stronger slowdown effect just to give us even more of an ability to control the big swarms and to be able to bring gigantic enemies to a standstill. But if you did want to go for the stronger corrosive damage over time effect, that could still work as well if you wanted to go for just pure raw damage. Next up for our secondary weapon, we of course are running the microwave gun, the Colette Wave Cooker, using its fantastic gamma contamination overclock. As I alluded to a little bit earlier, the gamma contamination overclock makes it so that way the beam itself is a little bit weaker and the ammo management is a little bit worse. However, it makes it so that way the beam has a chance to irradiate the enemy on hit. Now, what makes the irradiation effect that the gamma containment applies very good is it actually does it in 2 parts. It applies a damage over time effect to the enemy that it directly hits, but also makes a field of radiation around the enemy which can damage anything that gets too close. And of course, if you have multiple enemies that are irradiated, they can overlap and hit each other, which can be very useful. This coupled with the corrosive effect and the slowdown from the sludge pump again gives us the mass amount of crowd control that we are looking for. Applying this as well as several other damage over time effects from something like a scout or a gunner could be very devastating, especially to the bigger threats. To help make the wave cooker a little bit better, in Tier 1 I chose the Magnetron tube just for some extra magazine size because we are going to be using this primarily for damage over time effects. In Tier 2 I went with the heat sink just to give us a little bit less heat generation so we can keep the beam on target for a bit longer. In Tier 3 I went with the improved slowdown just to again give us even more crowd control. In Tier 4 the choice is kind of up to you, but I decided to go with the wide angle lens add-on on just to give us a little bit more area control since the beam DPS is already a little bit lacking. Then lastly, in tier 5, I went with the Contagion Transmitter. This basically makes it so that way it does extra damage to enemies that are corroded or in goo puddles, which are naturally going to be pretty much anything we go up against, and also makes it so that it has a chance to spread that effect to another enemy, which can again be incredibly useful, so it's kind of a no-brainer. Then briefly going over the rest of the equipment for the driller. For his satchel charges, I have a very standard setup that I like to use, which is just extra ammo in tiers 1 and 2, and then a bigger carb diameter in tier 4. His power drills are in a similar position where I'm just taking extra ammo in tiers 1 and 4, and the better cooling in tier 2. And then for armor rig, I'm running a very brief deviation off of what I normally run, which is bigger mineral bag in tier 1 just to carry some extra stuff, healthy in tier 2, and then of course breathing room in tier 4. So giving my final thoughts on this build and how I actually liked it, this was a lot of fun, especially for me, somebody who doesn't necessarily play driller a whole lot. This kind of build surprisingly worked very well, even though it seems a little bit unorthodox at first. The sludge blast and gamma contamination combo actually works very well at slowing down enemies in any kind of major holdout type missions such as salvage operations or sabotage missions. These things can do very, very well. And again, even the bigger threats that you're normally going to have trouble with are actually going to be made much easier because you're just going to be able to strip away their armor and do damage over time effects, which they really can't do much about. Again, bots are kind of the only real thing that you're going to be struggling against this, but in those situations, you probably just slightly change the build anyway, so it's not going to be that big of a deal. What's more is this build is actually very satisfying to use. Spreading all of those ailments and status effects to the enemies can be oddly satisfying to just see, and knowing that you are stopping the enemies dead in their tracks while slowly whittling them down is incredibly powerful even on the higher end difficulties. One of the hardest things you have to deal with, especially at Hazard 5 and up, is the fact that you really just don't want the enemies to get close to you because they're going to be hitting very hard, and this build does a very good job at stopping that directly in its tracks. Hope you guys enjoyed this build video. I very much liked putting together a driller build as I typically don't put those together too often, and this one was a lot of fun, and I very much want to hear what you guys think about it down in the comments. Is this similar to something you guys like, or do you like using something very different? Let me hear what you guys have to say. Anyway, hope you guys found this video informative and entertaining. If you did, please be sure to let me know by hitting that like button, as it tells me what types of videos you guys want to see. And consider becoming a member and subscribing today, as it really helps out the channel a lot. Rocket Stone Miners, I will see you in the next video.